Thank you so much. I want to ask two questions, and then I know Nikolai is on the line. I want to weigh in. I want to ask one of the questions because it also pertains to Nikolai and others. We can discuss this. So my first question has to do with the kind of unique, or to the degree to which there was a unique situation involving a specific individual who made possible the kind of cooperation that we were able to undertake in the past working with the 12th Duma, and that's Yevgeny Maslin, and his special relationship with Hal Smith. And I knew Maslin very well, and I think people who also knew him, Americans and Russians, regarded him as absolutely crucial to the progress that was made. So I put him out on the one side, and then I without mentioning names, I've interacted with other very senior Russians, some quite recently, who basically have said never again. And so I would be interested in your comments. I mean, without in any way suggesting that this is not a tremendously important exercise, I would like to kind of give your take, and Nikolai's also, the degree to which this may be replicable in some fashion in the future. Related to that, and that's why I'm asking the second question, is it conceived, I guess the question is, how unique is the verification challenge posed by Warheads? Is it conceivable that the techniques that you are employing applicable to other systems or issues that may not even be Russian specific, that would enable you to generate confidence in the operation of the system that might be easier for the Russians going down the road, or other countries as well, to embrace? And I have some ideas about systems that might work in this domain, and I'm pretty sure it was Alison Burke, but it may have been someone else who has spoken previously. I think you may have even been in the room, Ferenc, about techniques that were used in the bio domain that appeared relevant to the approach that's being used here. So those are the two kind of questions I want to put on the table here. And Nikolai, I know it's late in Vienna.
Yeah, let's go to Nikolai
so
first.
Maybe Nikolai, if you want to weigh in at all here, and then perhaps Bill, you and Miles might respond, and then others will join us in the conversation. Do we want this recorded still?
The quality of sound was not very good, Bill. But if I understand, you asked about the feasibility, basically, of the 12th GUMO agreeing to verification scheme, right?
But it was a question of, how crucial was a single individual in the person of General Maslin in making it possible to establish this extraordinary relationship that developed? And is it conceivable down the road that something like that could be done again?
No, he was absolutely crucial, of course. He had a lot of foresight, and he clearly understood the role of nuclear weapons and the dangers associated with nuclear weapons, and consequently the value of U.S.-Russian cooperation with introducing these dangers. I would say that well, it will be more difficult to achieve the same degree of cooperation in the future. Even with the political decisions, still, I think there will be more actual resistance, not just in the 12th GUMO, but broadly across the military. The generation that served during the Cold War, which saw all the deadlocks and all the dangers that emerged during the Cold War, has passed, is now generally, well, it's more hardline military leaders. I would not say that it's impossible. I would not say that they will be completely against any cooperation like that, that they will be against verification or stockpile, but well, it'll take more convincing. Basically, they will be much more cautious and much slower in accepting that. That said, well, they are generally professionals. Yes, as professionals that they will do their job. Yeah. As military, they will certainly follow political decisions. So, that's absolutely a sine qua non. Yes, that's an absolute condition. One big difference between Maslin and the current leadership, as far as I understand, well, the current chief of the 12th, Gomulka Kolesnikov, but that observation is not really just limited to Kolesnikov. Maslin will take initiative. He will try to press, from below. He will try to convince political leaders to expand cooperation. I would not expect such initiative from below from the current military leaders.
Thanks, Nikolai. Bill, you want?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in this because I love talking about Gerald Maslin. He was such a wonderful person and a great loss to us when he passed away last year. And he was absolutely crucial to convincing the Russian government, and I mean all the Russian government, to work with Americans on our cooperative threat reduction program. And he was the one that talked to the other leaders on fissile material, chemical, biological weapons. Biological, they didn't agree with him. He couldn't convince them. He talked to Petrov later after we'd done a lot of cooperation, said, hey, you should have started cooperating with Americans because look how good my program and my command is now that I'm working with the Russians or with the Americans. While he was crucial to that, the things I talked about that involved exchanging data and going to the site visits, that actually wasn't Maslin. And I would tell you, I don't think Maslin could have convinced Putin to allow us to go there because he wasn't a hardliner, because he was willing and open. You know who convinced him? It was General Valenkin. General Valenkin was a hardliner who assumed leadership of the 12th Main Director. In the first year in office, he wouldn't meet with us. And when we brought him to F.E. Warren was one of the first times when he met with a lot of the leaders. And that was really important because we gave him the respect as the commander of the 12th Main Directorate. He was the one that convinced Putin, I need to find some way to get the Americans there because I need this equipment for my purposes, for security of our weapons. That's what made it happen. And so that, to my conclusion is, and this is just one person's view, having worked with the 12th Main Directorate, is that it is possible if you consider the views from the perspective of the patriotic 12th Main Directorate personnel, that there are reasons why cooperation can benefit them as well. And that's what you need to be able to articulate. And go back to my example, my discussion about the sites in Belgorod. If the 12th Main Directorate is worried about the safety and security of warheads in Belgorod, it's up to them to convince Putin that something needs to be done, and there's no question that would have to be done cooperatively. So the precedent of having previous cooperation should make it available to re-engage if, say, a hardliner in the 12th Main Director were to convince Putin it's in their interest to be able to do that so that they could resume safety and security operations, or maybe they want to get out of that particular site. I'd love if that was the case. We'd even help them if that was the case. I don't think they're there by any means. We've seen evidence that they're shipping emergency response equipment to the area, but that tells you that they are worried about safety and security in that area. These are 12th Main Directorate shipments of equipment we've seen that they use to respond to accidents and incidents. So they're worried about it. And it was a good, we had a question yesterday at Stanford too about, the different organizations with Russia and who has what incentives. And I think if you look at it from the incentive of those who are in charge of their warheads, there are reasons why they might consider arms control or risk reduction measures for their own purposes, because they don't want an attack on their warheads either. So how to take those first steps, our political leaders are a lot smarter than I am on that. But here's one opportunity, which is if you were to do a bottom-up technical talk to start, that there might be some possibility of that. So that's probably as hopeful an answer I can provide as possible. And your second part about unique challenges of warheads. What's unique about warheads is you really can't see them on site in person. What is a warhead? You can't do that like you can do other arms control things. And so you have to have these other measures to give you confidence in what a warhead is or what your treaty limited item is. That's what's really unique and why we need more sophisticated tracking system, more sophisticated methodologies to keep track of things and report on them because of their movement and their size, you just physically can't watch all of them moving. There's too many of them moving too often, too many places. And so you need other methodologies to do that. And that's what's unique. And that's what we're trying to focus on that so that the other parts of arms control that we're actually quite good with and have had a lot of success with the Russians in the past could be used to then solidify an overall agreement.
Okay, I have more follow-up, but I won't monopolize the questions here. So who would care to ask some additional questions?
We have Nomsa online who might ask them.
Okay, let's have Nomsa, and then I think I saw Abner. So go ahead, Nomsa.
Hi, Bill. How are you?
Hi, Nomsa. Good to hear from you.
Nice to hear your voice and hear more of your experiences with threat reduction. And I guess my question was, if we're talking about using this model, for example, in a US-Russia risk reduction context, is there a possibility of maybe testing it out with a country that might be more willing to do this now and using that as an example to be like, look at how well the Xanadu people are managing the weapons?
I can take a crack.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, I mean, we've talked to the UK Atomic Weapons Establishment, and that is, I mean, we haven't talked in detail about this, but they would be the most likely people that we would try to do with it because they have some similar ways of handling weapons as US, and they're generally supportive of doing these kind of exercises of verification, which you've seen from UK, Norway, and so on.
Yeah, I think that's possible, but I also go back to my experience working with the 12th Maine Directorate was that they really valued at a higher level working directly with the US on things when it comes to warheads. It felt like, we are the elite party of two in the world in terms of composition and size of inventory. They worked with the French. They would kind of joke about their relationship with the French in a cooperative threat reduction program because they didn't audit things as vociferously as we did. They did work well with the Brits, provided super containers and a few other things. But they really valued work with the Americans. And so, in my opinion, while that could work, the better answer would be to try and do this using notional data instead of real data as an exercise. And that's kind of the path that we're going down with the State Department. Because we can do it where it's realistic data. My colleague Bill Delaney helped develop the blue passports for our project, and he worked nuclear security for his 30+ year career, CONUS and OCONUS. We use a lot of the realistic terminology for how OSD, nuclear matters, operates the warhead system. So we actually think that the way to try is to develop the notional database and do it as a tabletop type exercise first, and bring the Russians in as observers with the idea that maybe we could work at a technical team level after that. And, we have done a presentation to the Russian Academy of Sciences on the concept, and they were more approachable and open than we thought they might be. They didn't say no the first time.
When was this, Phil?
This was 6 months ago.
Yeah.
It was before February.
Yeah.
It was
So
longer
it
than
was
that.
it was about a year ago.
It was about a year ago. So, yeah, I'm not good with dates. We presented this briefing, or a version of this briefing, and they said, well, it has some potential. My experience working the Russians is usually they say no, then they say, ask questions and say why we're so stupid, and then they say maybe. So they actually start out with maybe. So that was a good sign. So I think using notional data might be a better way to go. And if there's hesitancy, we could develop notional data with other countries to make it even less about them. But I don't think that's going to be their problem. I think it's just probably getting to the table at all with it from any official type people.
Catherine, I think.
Yeah. As someone who knows nothing about the very mechanics of dealing with that kind of stuff, I have a few very basic questions. What is emanations? You use the word many times. What is it? The other thing is, why there is so much movement of warheads in tracks? Why it's not kind of stable thing that you keep it? Is there reasons of maintenance or something like that you? And the third thing is, what's actually the definition of a warhead? Is it actually, when we talk about non-strategic, is it actually the bomb that you put it in tied to either to aircraft or at the end of the missile? What is exactly the definition of the warhead?
Okay, so I can answer those
Yeah.
fairly quickly.
Yeah.
Parents can answer the emanations questions better than I can, but basically you have fissile material there.
Right.
And, it has some
Radiation.
and so you're measuring that as radiation, the different
Yeah.
elements of radiation that are coming off of that natural uranium and plutonium, and it has unique signatures. So that's what I mean by emanations. It might not even be the best term. Parents,
It's
feel free.
perfect. It's like,
Okay.
basically like a fingerprint of what the material actually is. So if you look at the gamma ray spectrum, it'll
So
tell you whether
And
uranium
each-
is
the
damaged.
composition of
Yeah.
the
And each
uranium and
warhead has
plutonium.
its own unique emanation?
Well, each kind, right? At least.
Yeah, which isotope it is. So you'll be able to tell whether it's weapons grade plutonium or reactor grade plutonium.
No, but for example, all W61 have the same one, or it's kind of different?
It will depend on when.
It depends. how much-
Age.
Depends on a lot
Yeah,
of
things
factors.
like age and so forth.
Yes.
You can get very, very precise, but the thing is, to get very, very precise, you get very, very sensitive, which is why that hasn't been a method that the sides have agreed to politically for security reasons. So warheads movements, why are there so many? Without getting into design information, you can just say that warheads made up of very many components, some of which degrade and need to be replaced. Just think of, I like to think of the simple terms as you got your batteries and you got your boosters. Your boosters decay and your batteries run out, and their lifetime is less than, dozens of years. So they have to be replaced.
Like tritium, for instance, has to be replaced.
Yeah, tritium would be
You
the booster bottles.
can bring the battery or bring the booster. Why it has to be moving so much?
Well, for some of the, depending on the warhead, because you can't handle them in certain places, you have to lift it out of the container, and you have to have all these safety and security concerns.
You can't have
Um,
troops doing that, basically. You need to have technicians.
Yeah, and the Russian and the US designs are very different, and the lifetimes of both differ by orders of magnitude. And they change over time based on the advanced science of the individual warheads. So when we were working on the warheads, they were really the old ones, and they were decaying. They do more operations in the field than we do. And that's why they had to move them so often for safety and security reasons. That's
Some of the
basically the
standard
answer.
If I
operations,
can just,
you just look
And
at the
yeah.
material and the
The
science.
course-
I mean, is
Yeah,
that
please
necessary?
jump in,
I'm
Nikolai.
sorry, go ahead, Nicola.
no, just wanted to note, the available information suggests, that Russia has actually been able to extend, warranty warheads to about 25 years, so it'll be less movement, but still, yes, there'll be movement. No
Less
question.
than there was during our time. It's certainly been declining. And as designs get advanced, that should decline over time. So there's less of it, but there still will always be some required.
Yeah,
And definition of warhead. Here's how we're defining a warhead. We define a warhead the way the two systems do. When not a component, but when a device is given from Department of Energy to the Department of Defense, that's called a warhead to the Department of Defense, and that's what we're going to call a warhead, no matter what components it is. When it's a device that's handed over, we'll call it a warhead. And same thing on the Russian side. When the Ministry of Atomic Energy has a device that they hand over through transfer of custody. So we're defining it organizationally. When it's in the custody, it's a device. It's in the custody of the Defense Department and Ministry of Defense. It's called a warhead because it could be used for a nuclear detonation. And that avoids trying to define it by components or serial numbers or any of all those things that get really, really complicated. And that's consistent with how the inventory management systems define what a warhead is. And that's what we're trying to
Could be a
do.
full bomb, actually.
Could be a what?
A full bomb, I mean, something that you attach to aircraft and.
Oh, yeah, it could be a gravity
Gravity.
bomb, a cruise missile, it could be a warhead on top of a ICBM,
then-
SLBM. They're all different. There are dozens and dozens of different kinds. When you look at them, apart from the delivery system, it's basically a nuclear device that can make a detonation. Different sizes and different components and different connections. But if it's a device, it can make a nuclear. We're going to define it as a warhead for purposes of our agreement, for purposes of inventory management. And I think that's something that we won't have too much problems with the Russians in terms of being able to define it if we do it that way. And one of the things I didn't emphasize in our thing is all this data I'm talking about, it's already compiled every day. You know, we're not creating new data, which is one of the problems that arms controls run into the past, telemetry and so forth, is they had to create new data notifications. This is data that exists today and is managed today, and it would actually be extracted for purposes of identifying individual warheads.
Thank you.
Yeah.
No other questions, please.
So my question is relating to how much information about the operational cycles and operational patterns of the actual delivery units
Mhm.
you could glean from this data set. So when you have the tracking system tracking the warhead to the, let's say, missile unit,
Mhm.
you're tracking when the missile unit takes possession of that warhead and when it leaves the missile unit. And so I'm just curious, like, if there are concerns about revealing operational patterns that might be problematic for the data set.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly the right question, and that's exactly the right question we would have to start with to negotiate with the other side. Because, and the way we express it in our thing is you have to negotiate the amount of data per challenge and the frequency of the challenges. Because you don't want to reveal those sort of military information. So our viewpoint would be, there would be a limit on how many challenges you could do per warhead, for example. It could, maybe it'd be a dozen, maybe it'd be only a handful, right? And the two sides would say, how much is going to be revealed if I do a dozen? How much will I learn on the other side? I mean, this is exactly a negotiation. Part of our contract, follow-on contract with State Department is we're working with CSIS Pony, who has a negotiating simulator that we're going to actually simulate exactly that negotiation to see what some outcomes might be. So our system doesn't define exactly how many it should be, but that's a key question. It's going to be in our follow-on contract. How much, how frequent, how much per warhead, so that the sides get the confidence without revealing some of those operational secrets that they don't want revealed.
Thanks.
And just to know, would you be able to introduce yourselves for our participants online?
Oh, sorry, I'm Dr. Upworth. I'm a GRA here at CNS.
Please.
I'm Sam. I'm also a GRA here, Sam Lair. I'm kind of further building on this idea of confidence. I'm curious as to how the warhead tracking system would ensure that the data submitted to the ledgers is genuine in the first place, or how that data is not being spoofed by the Russians, right?
Yeah.
Every time that we propose arms control, the question of verification and Soviet and or Russian cheating is introduced. I'm curious as to how this system is able to address that question.
Well, that's a great question, because that's a part of the presentation that I skipped today. Because it gets pretty technical, but one of the ways, and this is just one of the ways that we want to get at that, is an advanced data analytic tool called Zero Knowledge SNARK. It's something I only learned about in this process. Dr. Dan Bonet at Stanford is one of the leading proponents of this, and his PhD student Neil Perry is actually wrote the SNARK program for us. And what a SNARK program can do is it's based on a mathematical proof and can be used to interrogate the data that was used to create the hash code without revealing the data. So in building our passports, we set up a bunch of rules for those passports. Rules such as there's a shipment from the rail transfer point at Saratov to the airbase at Engels. That shipment will need to be within 5 to 8 hours because it's not too far away. So we set up a system based on realistic rules of 3 pages of requirements. An inventory check must be conducted at least once a year on all the warheads. A maintenance check must be done every so often, depending on the warhead type and so forth. So all of those rules can be compiled into a SNARK mathematical proof program that can be run against the data before any of it's revealed, and can ask questions such as, is all the date time in sequence? Is there a date and time where that warhead has existed for its entirety of its life cycle? In other words, there's no blanks, right? Those kind of questions that you would like to ask before you even start revealing all of it. Now, that doesn't prove all of the data is valid everywhere, but it increases your confidence that if they made it all up, they made it up pretty damn well to meet all the rules that we agreed on to meet. And to make that all up well, and then never get caught through one of our NTM checks or a follow-on check would be, I don't know, I couldn't imagine how to do that. I'm sure there's people a lot smarter than me that could figure it out, but it would be really complex, and the chances of getting caught would be pretty good, certainly over time. But that's exactly the right question, and why we've developed the proof of concept to the Russians. Now, what needs to be done next, which since that doesn't do everything, is this kind of system would need to be red teamed to see that you couldn't, and we would need some real technical experts that know SNARK tools and how to write them better than I can and so forth. I imagine we'll bring in experts and labs, and if this takes hold, State Department will want to do that to get into that question more deeply. It's absolutely the right question that needs some more work, but we've at least, working with notional databases is something where you can kind of test that out.
And we ran some, right? We had some SNARKs through
Yeah.
problems even developing.
Yeah, exactly. There were like 5 of us that made up these passports. Ference did a bunch of them. I don't know how many you did, half dozen or so, and I did a bunch. Vasily did some, right? And after we did them, it turned out we used different assumptions on some of the transportation. So the SNARK program that was developed by Neil Perry, he ran it against our passports, and he said, oh, you have invalid data here and there. And he found something in almost every passport that wasn't quite right, and we had to make corrections. But that back and forth, my big takeaway was the back and forth between Neil and I looking at the data. I would have never found these problems looking at it myself. No way in hell I could have ever figured it out. But I worked the rules with him and he wrote the program and we went back and forth. We were doing emails 3 times a day. How about this red one? How about this red two? You know, it was very realistic. And that's exactly the kind of process that you would run through when you're developing cooperative programs like this. And I would imagine would apply to a technical discussion on that. So those are exactly the right questions we would be asking each other.
I would say 2 other things. I mean, one is that, you know, again, this is part of a broad system, so there's gonna be an on-site inspection. Part of it that's really gonna be looking for undeclared warheads. And the other part is organizationally, it would be very tough to maintain, say, a duplicate database of where your actual nuclear warheads are, because these are just very complicated to manage these systems, and then you have you run your own risks of losing control of your weapons doing that. So it's,
Miles, so this is obviously driven by concern on the part of the United States to have confidence in being able to verify the much larger number of Russian non-strategic warheads. How do you kind of address that symmetry issue in terms of taking note of what may be different Russian interests with respect to the kinds of warheads of interest to them? And if in fact we're talking about non-strategic warheads, then there's the issue of the inspections on European states, territories, and other kinds of political, as well as kind of the military issues. And so I'm kind of curious the extent to which you try to build in issues of concern from a Russian perspective, recognizing that the numbers look very, very different from the 2 sides.
Let me add a couple, and then Miles and Nikolai can jump in. But one of the things that we identified up front and early, the Russians may be concerned about distinguishing a a strategic non-nuclear system of ours from a strategic nuclear system. That's something we assert. We have certain arms control agreements. If you had an agreement that governed where warheads the locations that can be at and be able to validate and track warheads, that would increase the confidence about the non-nuclear strategic systems on our side that they're concerned about. Now, that's not a complete answer, because that's probably not as big a concern to them as the dual use nature of their shorter range and tactical delivery systems. But I think it's one that they could be concerned with. And I'll let the others, Nikolai and Miles, take the other parts of the question.
sure, 2 elements. One is on the numbers issue. And one thing that I've tended to emphasize is when people hear arms control, they hear reductions, and this is more about transparency. I don't think we don't necessarily have to get rid of any weapons on the Russian side to get benefits from this agreement. So in that sense, what they've always, we've always they tend to say, we're not going to reduce yours unless you reduce ours unless you move all your weapons out of Europe. Well, you don't have to reduce yours. The other part that's, is that we will have to do an agreement with all of the NATO countries, not just the ones, when you did the INF, it was obvious who had the bases, who had the weapons and where they were based. But because they're neither confirm nor deny policy of NATO for housing these the warheads, we're gonna have to do an agreement with all of the NATO countries, which are now 32. So I'm not sure it's more complicated.
Long-term project, lots of funding.
Right, I'm not sure it's more complicated on the Russian side than ours. I mean, even though they have many more weapons, we have probably an equivalent number of facilities that will need to be, they could call for inspections at, and so on. Nikolai, you want to?
Yes, thank you. Yes, Russia has more non-strategic nuclear warheads. Yes, theoretically, that would call for more inspections. Yes, and Russians will hardly would agree to that. They always insist on equal rights. Is I would actually emphasize what Miles just mentioned. Transparency here is more important than actual limits. A warhead in storage doesn't really have military utility unless you mate it to a delivery vehicle. So it's important to know the numbers, the locations, and the movements. So as long as they're not mated, well, that's not that actually dangerous. So that's one kind of point. And the second point, Bill already actually mentioned that the system that we propose in that study applies actually to the entire nuclear stockpile. Yes, and if we looked at an agreement that addresses the entire nuclear stockpiles of both countries of the United States and Russia, then actually the differences numbers is not that. It's actually big. So yes, I think it's all actually doable. Yes, it's just a matter of agreement. As long as we got political will, you can find a solution to that. It might be a challenge, but that challenge is not insurmountable.
Thank you so much, Nikolai. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Miles. This was a fascinating set of presentations and discussion. So please join me in expressing our appreciation to our honored guests.